Welcome to Mystery Cafe, your ultimate stop for gripping detective stories, chilling mysteries, and unforgettable investigations. Here, every video serves a fresh dose of suspense, shocking twists, and cases that challenge your inner detective. From classic whodunits to modern crime stories, we bring the world of mystery straight to your screen, where every clue matters and no secret stays buried for long. Before we start unraveling today's mystery, we'd love to know, where are you watching from? Globe showing Europe, Africa. Drop your country, city, or stay in the comments, and let's see how far the Mystery Cafe family reaches. Magnifying glass tilted right.
Allan Pinkerton and the Murder at Ashdown College. Chapter 1, An Invitation to Oxford. It was a bitter December morning in Chicago when the telegram arrived. Outside my window, the city lay wrapped in gray frost, smoke from the stockyards hanging low across the rooftops. I had risen early, as was my custom, and was sifting through the ordinary stack of correspondence brought in by my secretary, letters of inquiry from clients, routine reports from agents in the field, bills, and circulars. My hand paused when I reached an envelope of far better quality than the rest. The paper was thick and creamy, the sort that only the wealthy trouble themselves to order. The wax seal, already cracked by transit, bore a crest I did not recognize at first glance, though its flourishes spoke of old lineage. The message inside was not American at all. It was written in an elegant English hand, each letter carefully formed. The sender announced herself as Lady Margaret Winthrop of Ashdown College, Oxford. She wrote that an event of historical importance was to take place at the college, the unveiling of a manuscript by Professor Edwin Selby, a scholar of Elizabethan statecraft. She believed this manuscript contained truths long hidden, truths that could shake reputations, unsettle noble families, and alter the understanding of England's history. Her words were wrapped in formality, but beneath them I read the tremor of anxiety. She wrote that my attendance was most earnestly requested. She did not explain why a Scottish-born detective working in America should be summoned to a gathering of Oxford scholars, but her tone carried urgency. It was not a mere invitation to witness an academic lecture. It was a call for watchfulness, for intervention. I read the telegram twice before setting it down. In my line of work, one learns to weigh not only what is written but what is withheld. A professor's lecture, even one involving ancient state papers, should not trouble an aristocrat to such a degree. If Lady Margaret called me across the Atlantic, it was because she expected danger. I poured myself coffee, sat back, and considered. My career had carried me through every manner of case: bank robberies, assassins, counterfeiters, labor spies, and railroad thieves. But this was something different. This was the world of scholars and nobles, of secrets buried not in alleyways but in archives. And yet, murder is an old trade. It flourishes as well in cloisters and drawing rooms as it does in backstreets. By the time the morning was out, I had resolved to go. My agency could manage its affairs in my absence, and besides, the crossing held its appeal. I had not set foot in Oxford since my early years in Britain, and there was something about Lady Margaret's plea that struck a chord. Perhaps it was her mention of reputations at risk. I had long believed that the most respectable masks often conceal the darkest truths. The Atlantic passage in December is never comfortable. The ship pitched and groaned under winter squalls, salt spray freezing on the rails. Yet as I stood upon the deck, watching the horizon, I felt the familiar sense of anticipation that came before a new case. I turned over the few facts I possessed. Selby, the scholar. Lady Margaret, the patroness. A manuscript said to expose Elizabethan intrigues. An invitation to a private gathering at Ashdown College. No crime yet committed, but an atmosphere ripe for it. After a week at sea and a jolting train journey across England, I arrived in Oxford. The city rose from the mist like a dream from another century. Stone spires pierced the grey sky, bells tolled from hidden towers, and the cobbled streets glistened with frost. Every wall seemed steeped in age, every courtyard whispered of generations who had passed before. Ashwell College stood a little apart from the main thoroughfares, its gatehouse looming dark against the winter twilight. I presented Lady Margaret's letter to the porter, a stout man in a heavy coat who eyed me with suspicion until he read the crest. His manner changed at once, and he directed me through a series of cloisters and quadrangles, their flagstones slick with ice, until I reached the set of chambers reserved for distinguished guests. The fire had been lit, the bed turned down. The college prided itself on hospitality. Yet even as I warmed myself, I felt a strange current in the air, as though the very stones carried unease. I could not yet name it, but my instincts told me I had walked into a place where old loyalties and resentments smoldered, waiting for the spark. An hour later, a knock sounded upon the door. A servant handed me a short note in Lady Margaret's own hand. It welcomed me formally to Ashwell and confirmed that the gathering would commence the following evening at 6 o'clock in Professor Selby's study. The words were graceful, but again that undertone of strain was there. She added a final line, one that caught my attention: "I trust your vigilance, Mr. Pinkerton, will be equal to the occasion." I set the note aside and stared into the fire. Vigilance. That was not a word chosen at random. Lady Margaret expected trouble. Whether it would be academic squabbles erupting into violence, or something darker still, I could not yet tell. But I knew one thing: this was no ordinary dinner among dons. The rest of that evening I spent acquainting myself with the college grounds. I paced the quadrangles, noting the shadows beneath the archways, the glimmer of lantern light against frosted stone. I studied the layout of the buildings, the narrow passages where one might come or go unseen. In my profession, the setting is as much a player as the people. A man may conceal a weapon as easily in a scholar's gown as in a gambler's vest. I paused before the window of the library. Inside, students bent over their books, oblivious to the world beyond. Knowledge is a noble pursuit, yet knowledge too can kill. I had no doubt that whatever Selby intended to reveal, someone feared it enough to summon me here. That night, as the bells tolled midnight, I lay awake beneath the heavy blankets of my guest chamber. The cold stone walls seemed to close in, and my thoughts circled endlessly. Why had Lady Margaret chosen me? Why not appeal to the local constabulary, or the dons of the college? The answer, I suspected, was that she sought discretion. She expected something scandalous, something that, if exposed too quickly, could ruin reputations beyond repair. I resolved then that I would keep my eyes and ears open from the first. I would observe each guest, weigh their words, and watch their hands. In 24 hours, the manuscript would be unveiled. But already I sensed that the real revelations would not come from parchment, but from the faces of those gathered around it. The snow began to fall lightly outside, dusting the ancient roofs of Oxford. I rose and trimmed the lamp, setting my notebook ready upon the desk. A case had begun, not in the smoke of Chicago nor the backrooms of Washington, but here, in the hushed cloisters of England's oldest university. And I knew, as surely as I had known in every case before, that before this business was over there would be death. Chapter 2: The Gathering Storm. The following evening brought with it the kind of English winter twilight I remembered from boyhood, cold, damp, and heavy with fog. As the train from London slowed into Oxford, the lamps of the city gleamed through the mist like lanterns in a dream. I stepped down onto the platform with my valise in hand, my mind already upon the case. Lady Margaret's letter had not left me since I first read it. The tone between the lines still whispered of danger. A cab conveyed me through the narrow streets, past ancient colleges and cloisters whose stone walls seemed to breathe the centuries. Oxford carried with it a weight of tradition. Every spire and turret bore the memory of scholars long dead. Yet beneath that dignity, I felt a disquiet, as though the place itself understood the tension building within its walls. The porter at Ashwell College met me with a lantern and led me across the quadrangle. The stones were slick with frost, the night air sharp in the lungs. He guided me to a Tudor building with mullioned windows and a carved oak door darkened by age. "Professor Selby's rooms, sir," he said, and left me there with a bow. Inside, warmth greeted me. A fire roared in the great hearth, casting shadows across paneled walls lined with books. The study was a scholar's paradise, shelves to the ceiling, cabinets of manuscripts, scrolls, and relics. The air smelled of leather, old paper, and smoke. Yet the room carried something more, a strain, invisible but present, like a string drawn too taut. Lady Margaret Winthrop received me at the door. She was a handsome woman of 55, her grey hair styled with care, her gown of dark blue silk elegant but severe. She extended her hand graciously, though her smile never reached her eyes. "Mr. Pinkerton," she said. "How grateful I am that you accepted my invitation. This evening will prove significant." Her tone confirmed my suspicion. This was no mere gathering of academics. At the desk stood Professor Edwin Selby, the man whose work had summoned us all. He was tall, lean, and slightly stooped, as scholars often are after years bent over manuscripts. His beard was neatly trimmed, his eyes dark and intense. He greeted me warmly, though I detected a nervous tremor in the hand that adjusted his spectacles. "Mr. Pinkerton," he said, "I am honored by your presence. Tonight, I intend to share discoveries that will, I believe, rewrite chapters of our history. They are not without controversy, and not without consequence." The guests were assembled in small knots of conversation. I moved among them, noting each carefully. Dr. Julian Cross, professor of history at the college, was a man of middle years, with thinning hair and sharp features. He greeted me curtly, impatience etched upon his face. When Selby spoke, Cross's expression soured, his mouth twitching as if suppressing contempt. Rivalry, I thought at once. Near the professor's desk stood Miss Dorothy Hale, Selby's secretary. She was plainly dressed, spectacles perched upon her nose, her movements quiet but efficient. She carried herself with the air of one used to being overlooked, yet her eyes were watchful. Selby praised her as indispensable, though she blushed and said nothing. 3 graduate students lingered near the windows. Their youth betrayed them, they shifted awkwardly, uncertain whether to speak or remain silent. Their eyes followed every word with nervous intensity. As I observed, the atmosphere thickened. Selby spoke in hints, almost taunting his audience with the promise of revelations. He declared his findings would expose the duplicity of certain noble families in Elizabeth's court, families long believed to be pillars of loyalty. His words drew visible reactions. Lady Margaret paled, her knuckles widening upon her glass. Dr. Cross frowned darkly, his gaze narrowing. Miss Hale's eyes glimmered with quiet pride. I stepped closer to the desk and noticed something curious. Amid the scholarly clutter, Selby had placed a silver inkpot, polished and gleaming, an object of obvious antiquity. "A fine piece," I remarked. "Indeed," Selby replied with pride. "A gift from Lady Margaret herself. 16th century, perfectly suited for tonight's work. How fitting that secrets from Elizabeth's court be recorded with an artifact from her age. Lady Margaret inclined her head but said nothing. Her eyes, however, flickered briefly with unease. The professor continued, his enthusiasm mounting. History, Mr. Pinkerton, is a tapestry woven not only with truth but with lies. Those who wrote it often had cause to conceal more than they revealed. But documents survive. They wait for the persistent scholar. He raised his glass. Tonight, those lies will be unmasked. The room was silent but for the crackle of the fire. I looked around, studying each face. Lady Margaret, rigid with dread. Dr. Cross, scowling with restrained fury. The students, wide-eyed. Miss Hale, attentive and loyal. It was plain to me that the evening was not merely academic. Secrets lay buried here, and Selby intended to drag them into light. But secrets, once exposed, can destroy. And destruction breeds motive. By the time the clock struck the hour, the guests had gathered in a semicircle before Selby's desk. The professor's manuscript lay ready, the silver inkpot gleaming at his side, the pages awaiting his hand. As I took my place, I felt the weight of the moment pressing down. This was no longer the anticipation of scholarship. It was the hush before a storm. I knew, with a certainty born of long experience, that before this night ended, the truths unveiled would not only concern the past, they would claim a life in the present. Chapter 3, Words of Death. The gathering in Professor Selby's study had the curious air of both a salon and a tribunal. The fire burned low, the port glasses stood half empty, and yet no one was at ease. Each guest sat rigid, waiting for the unveiling of secrets that promised to rattle the bones of history. Professor Selby took his place behind the heavy mahogany desk that dominated the room. Before him lay his manuscript, page upon page arranged in meticulous order, and beside it, gleaming beneath the lamplight, the silver Tudor inkpot Lady Margaret had gifted him. He handled it as though it were some sacred relic, his long fingers brushing its ornate lid. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying the cadences of a man accustomed to lecturing crowded halls. "What I place before you tonight is the culmination of 5 years' labor, 5 years of hunting through forgotten archives, private collections, and dusty parish chests. These documents," he gestured toward the manuscript, "will alter our understanding of Elizabeth's reign. More than that, they will unmask truths deliberately buried for centuries." He let the words hang in the air, his gaze sweeping over the company. Lady Margaret sat stiff as stone, her lips pressed into a thin line. Dr. Julian Cross shifted in his chair, his sharp features hardening into something close to resentment. Miss Dorothy Hale, the secretary, stood near the shelves, her eyes fixed on Selby with a devotion that seemed almost religious. The 3 graduate students leaned forward, eager, but their expressions betrayed unease. Selby's tone grew more forceful. "History, you see, is not merely a tale of monarchs and ministers. It is a mask, constructed by those who wished to preserve their legacies unblemished. But documents endure. Parchments survive the centuries. They whisper truths, if one has the patience to listen." He reached for his fountain pen, uncapped it, and dipped it into the inkpot. The motion was unhurried. Almost ceremonial. He drew a line across the top of a page, then began to write a note in the margin of his manuscript as he spoke. "I shall begin with the matter of the Winthrop family." At the mention of her name, Lady Margaret's fingers tightened around her evening bag. She stared straight ahead, her expression carefully composed, but a faint pallor had overtaken her cheeks. Contrary to the accepted record, Selby continued, there exists evidence that the Winthrops were far from unwavering in their loyalty during the Essex Rebellion of 1601. Indeed, one branch of the family appears to have corresponded with the rebels. His hand faltered. The pen slipped, leaving a blot of dark blue ink across the page. He frowned, shook his wrist slightly, then tried again. I was watching him closely, closer than anyone else in that room. Years of experience had taught me to observe not only words but the smallest tremor of the hand, the faintest change in complexion. And what I saw unsettled me. A sheen of sweat had appeared upon Selby's brow. His lips trembled as though the effort of forming words had suddenly become immense. I beg your pardon, he muttered, I feel. He did not finish. His eyes rolled upward, and his body convulsed with sudden violence. The pen clattered from his grasp, spattering ink across the manuscript. His shoulders jerked, his arms thrashed, and a low, guttural sound forced itself from his throat. Good God, exclaimed Dr. Cross, springing to his feet. Lady Margaret half rose, her face drained of blood. Miss Hale gave a sharp cry and rushed forward, but froze midway, horror fixing her in place. The professor pitched forward across the desk. The silver inkpot toppled, spilling its contents in a spreading stain that consumed the neatly ordered manuscript pages. The firelight flickered across his face, which was now ghastly pale, the lips tinged blue. His chest heaved once, twice, and then stilled. For a long moment, no one moved. The only sound was the faint hiss of the fire and the drip of ink pattering onto the carpet. The air seemed to thicken with the finality of what had occurred. I stepped forward, my voice sharp, cutting through the paralysis that held the room. No one is to touch a thing. This is no seizure, no ordinary collapse. This is murder. The word struck them like a blow. Lady Margaret sank back into her chair, her hands trembling violently now. Dr. Cross stammered, impossible, it must have been his heart, his voice faltered under my stare. He had seen death before, he knew this was different. The graduate students huddled together near the window, pale and whispering among themselves. Miss Hale stood frozen, her hands pressed to her mouth, her eyes locked upon her master's lifeless form. I leaned closer to the desk, careful not to disturb anything. The manuscript pages lay scattered, stained by both ink and death. The overturned inkpot gleamed dully, its contents spreading like a dark tide. Selby's hand, resting stiff upon the blotched paper, bore several small cuts and abrasions, old wounds, the kind one earns from handling brittle parchment and bindings. That detail caught my attention at once. I had seen poisons delivered by subtler means than food or drink. A man could be killed by what he touched as easily as by what he swallowed. Turning, I addressed the room with deliberate calm. You will all remain here until the authorities arrive. No one is to leave. No one is to alter the scene. This chamber is now a crime scene, and every one of you is a witness, or a suspect. Silence followed, heavy as the oak beams overhead. I could see the fear flickering behind their eyes. Each of them had come expecting an evening of revelations about the past. Instead, they found themselves enmeshed in a crime of the present. I drew a notebook from my pocket and began to sketch the arrangement of the room. Where each guest sat, where Selby had collapsed, where the inkpot had fallen. Such details might later prove decisive. A murderer's hand often reveals itself not in bold strokes but in overlooked minutiae. As I worked, I reflected on what I had witnessed. The precision of the convulsions, the rapid onset, the discoloration of the skin, these bore all the hallmarks of a swift-acting poison. The inkpot, the pen, the tiny cuts upon Selby's fingers, they fit together in a pattern both ingenious and cruel. Whoever planned this death knew the professor's habits intimately. They counted on him dipping his pen into that pot, counted on the poison entering through wounds he barely noticed. I closed my notebook and surveyed the faces before me. Lady Margaret, rigid with terror but clinging to dignity. Dr. Cross, his clever eyes darting like a cornered animal. Miss Hale, pale, stricken, yet curiously steady. And the three students, wide-eyed, whispering, but hiding something, perhaps fear, perhaps knowledge. Somewhere among them sat the hand that had poured poison into a scholar's ink. Somewhere among them, the truth waited to be uncovered. And so, amid the scattered manuscripts and the stench of ink, began my investigation into the murder at Ashwell College. Chapter 4, The Method Revealed. The Oxford Constabulary answered my summons with more haste than I expected. Within 20 minutes of Professor Selby's collapse, a physician and 2 officers arrived at the study. The college porter had guided them through the quadrangles, their boots crunching frost upon the flagstones. The physician was Dr. Thornbury, a stout gentleman in his 60s, whose silver whiskers and country manner might have belonged to a genial uncle had his expression not been so grave. He wasted no time in kneeling beside the body. His hands were steady, his examination methodical. Meanwhile, Inspector George Morrison of the Oxford Police, a solid, barrel-chested man with a skeptical air, took his place by the hearth, watching everything with suspicion. While the others looked on in hushed dismay, I kept my eyes fixed on the details, the scatter of manuscript pages, the overturned inkpot, the stains seeping into the rug, and the small abrasions upon Selby's fingers. These were no random coincidences. They were signposts, pointing toward a deliberate hand. At length Dr. Thornbury rose, his face clouded. He removed his spectacles, polished them with a handkerchief, and spoke with quiet finality. This was no seizure. No heart attack. No stroke. I have seen this pattern before. The violent convulsions, the sudden pallor, the speed of decline, gentlemen, Professor Selby was poisoned. The words fell like stones into the room. Lady Margaret gave a soft cry and pressed a handkerchief to her lips. Dr. Cross, who had been pacing near the shelves, stopped dead in his tracks and stared. The graduate students whispered nervously to one another, and Miss Hale, her face chalk white, closed her eyes for a moment, then straightened with visible effort. Inspector Morrison folded his arms. Poisoned? But how? We all shared the same port. We all partook of the same refreshments. None of us has fallen ill. Precisely, Thornbury said. That fact alone tells us the toxin was delivered not through food or drink, but by some other means. And it acted with unusual swiftness, mere minutes from contact to death. A concentrated dose of a potent alkaloid, I should think. Likely absorbed directly into the bloodstream. I stepped forward, fixing my gaze on the physician. Through the skin? Thornbury nodded reluctantly. Yes. There exist certain agents capable of such a feat with even the smallest cut or abrasion. The path into the body is clear. The memory of Selby's scarred fingertips returned to me. I turned to Miss Hale. Madam, you worked with the professor for 20 years. Tell me, did he often suffer cuts upon his hands? Her gray eyes flickered. Yes. Constantly. From parchment edges, from the clasps of old bindings, even from the splinters of oak boxes. He picked at the cuts, too, he could never leave them to heal. Morrison scowled. And you mean to say the poison was painted onto his books? Not books, I answered, pointing to the desk. The ink. The inspector bent over the upended pot, eyeing the blue stain. "In all my 30 years of service," he muttered, "I've never heard of such a thing." "Which is precisely why it succeeded," I replied. "The murderer knew Selby would dip his pen into that pot. They knew he would handle it repeatedly, and that the poison, blended with the ink, would pass into his system through those tiny cuts." Lady Margaret gasped softly. Dr. Cross uttered an incredulous laugh. "Ingenious," he said, though the color had drained from his face. "Ingenious, yes," I said grimly. "And calculated." This was not an act of passion. It required planning, patience, and an intimate knowledge of the professor's habits. Morrison rubbed his chin, skeptical still. But the inkpot sat in plain sight. Any one of us might have tampered with it. "Not quite," I answered. "That piece was not normally left upon the desk. It belonged in that cabinet." I pointed toward a tall glass-fronted case in the corner, where Selby kept his rarest possessions. "Lady Margaret herself told us she gifted it to him last year." "Miss Hale, where was it usually kept?" "In the cabinet," she whispered. "Always locked away, except on special occasions." The inspector strode over and examined the lock. It was intact. From the chain on Selby's waistcoat dangled the small cabinet key, undisturbed. Morrison shook his head. "So how in blazes did it end up here, tainted, hours before the presentation?" "That," I said, "is the puzzle." Dr. Thornberry had resumed his place near the fire, shaking his head in somber reflection. "The poison acted quickly," he said. 2-3 minutes from exposure to death. Whoever administered it must have done so long before the professor sat at his desk. The silence that followed was taut as wire. Each face in that room bore guilt or fear of some shade. I knew what they were thinking, that the murderer had walked among them all afternoon, had prepared their trap under the very noses of the college. I crouched beside the cabinet, examining the dust upon its shelves, the faint marks where the inkpot had once rested. Whoever had taken it knew how to avoid forcing the lock. They had used the key, or at least handled it while Selby was distracted. I turned back to Miss Hale. "Did the professor ever leave his key unattended?" Her answer came slowly, reluctantly. "On rare occasions. At tea, perhaps. He disliked carrying the chain when working with fragile manuscripts. He would lay it aside, sometimes upon the mantel, sometimes upon the desk." My eyes swept the room again, cataloguing expressions. Dr. Cross stood with his arms folded tight, anger smoldering behind his composure. Lady Margaret sat rigid, her silk gown catching the firelight, her eyes fixed on the rug. The students remained clustered together, whispering nervously. And Miss Hale herself, though pale, now spoke with a steadiness that drew my attention. The inspector broke the silence at last. "So one of these fine scholars took the key, unlocked the cabinet, poisoned the ink, and returned it, all without the professor knowing?" "Precisely," I said. "And not only that. They timed it so that the pot would be upon his desk when he rose to deliver his lecture. That timing is the mark of someone who knew his schedule intimately." Morrison exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Lord save me, this is devil's work." "It is calculation," I corrected. "Cold, deliberate, and merciless. Whoever did this wanted Selby silenced at the very height of his triumph, with his discovery scattered useless under his body." I let my gaze fall once more upon the ink-stained pages, upon the scholar's life-work ruined in a single moment. Such precision spoke volumes about the killer. They had not only the motive but the patience and intellect to devise a method both subtle and certain. As the inspector barked orders for the room to be sealed, I made a private vow. I had crossed an ocean not to watch secrets smothered in ink, but to draw them into daylight. This crime was no accident of scholarship, it was murder, crafted with the pen and planned like a campaign. And I intended to uncover the hand that had dipped it in poison. Chapter 5, Secrets and Motives. The morning after Professor Selby's death dawned grey and cold. A freezing mist clung to the spires of Oxford, and the bells tolled mournfully through the damp air. The town carried on with its ordinary rhythms, students hurrying to lectures, porters sweeping leaves from the quads, but within Ashwell College, a silence hung heavy. The tragedy in Selby's study had already spread by whispers among the cloisters, and every passerby seemed to lower their voice when they came near the building. Inspector Morrison and I had secured a conference chamber adjoining the late professor's rooms. The heavy oak table, polished to a dull sheen, was bare save for my notebook, the inspector's blotter, and a pitcher of water with 2 glasses. It was there that we began the sober task of questioning each member of the ill-fated gathering. I insisted on speaking to them one at a time. A group inquiry scatters truths into defensive half-statements. One-on-one, the mask is thinner. Dr. Julian Cross. Dr. Cross was summoned first. He entered with the air of a man who had not slept. His dark hair was uncombed, his tie loose, and the circles beneath his eyes made him look older than his years. Still, he attempted dignity as he sat, folding his hands with a show of calm. "Dr. Cross," I began, "you were Professor Selby's colleague for many years. How would you describe your relationship?" His lips pressed into a thin line before he answered. "Professional. Courteous. Not warm." I leaned forward. "Not warm because of rivalry?" He flushed slightly. "In scholarship, rivalry is inevitable. But yes, Selby and I often disputed matters of interpretation. I have published for 30 years on Elizabethan politics. My books are the standard texts." His claims, if verified, would have destroyed that foundation overnight. The words hung in the room. Morrison scribbled in his notebook. I studied Cross's trembling hands. "Did you know the content of his discoveries before last night?" I asked. "He telephoned me yesterday morning," Cross admitted. He was elated. Said he had found evidence implicating noble families in treachery during the Essex Rebellion. He spoke of revolutionizing history. He could barely contain himself. His voice tightened. If he had been correct, my own life's work would have been rendered obsolete. The bitterness was unmistakable. Cross saw it, too, and tried to recover. "But disagreement is no cause for murder, Mr. Pinkerton. I am a scholar, not a criminal." He left the chamber looking unsteady, his academic pride exposed like a raw wound. "Lady Margaret Winthrop." Lady Margaret followed, dignified in her silk gown but pale about the cheeks. She lowered herself into the chair as if weighed down by centuries of ancestry. "Lady Margaret," I said gently, "you sponsored Selby's research." "Why?" Her gloved hands twisted in her lap. "My family has always supported historical inquiry. The Winthrops pride themselves on our commitment to scholarship and the preservation of truth. Even when that truth might prove unflattering." Her eyes flickered, and for the first time her composure faltered. "You must understand. The Winthrop name is more than a collection of letters. It is trust, foundation, duty. Our charitable works, our standing in society, these depend upon an honorable reputation. If Selby's documents painted my ancestors as traitors, it would stain us irreparably. Our good works would be overshadowed by shame." Her voice dropped to a whisper. I begged him to temper his conclusions. He would not listen. I made a note. Wealth and reputation are as sharp motives as money itself. A family's honor can drive desperate acts. The graduate students. We questioned the three young men together only briefly before separating them. Each told a slightly different story, but together their fragments formed a revealing pattern. Young Peton, pale and twitching, admitted he had once accessed Selby's notes without permission. He confessed to copying passages for his own thesis, fearing his career would falter without Selby's insights. The second, Hartwell, acknowledged overhearing late-night discussions between Selby and Miss Hale. He spoke of discoveries that would scandalize the nobility, Hartwell whispered. He seemed almost giddy with the thought of shocking the world. The third, Morrison, no relation to the inspector, said tension in the department had grown unbearable. Everyone knew Selby was hiding something. He kept his research locked away. Faculty felt excluded, slighted. Resentment festered. Ambition, envy, secrecy, the soil in which betrayal thrives. I noted them all. Yet I judged the students more opportunistic than calculating. Their fear now seemed genuine. Miss Dorothy Hale. At last we summoned Miss Dorothy Hale. She entered quietly, dressed in sober gray, spectacles glinting in the dim light. Though she appeared composed, her eyes betrayed sleeplessness. You worked with Professor Selby for 2 decades, I said. You knew his habits better than anyone. Her chin lifted slightly, pride breaking through her reserve. I was his secretary, yes. But more than that, I was his assistant in every sense. I typed, transcribed, organized, collated. I verified references. I accompanied him into archives. Without my labor, his work would never have reached its present form. Yet your name appears nowhere in the manuscript, I said. Her composure cracked. That was his decision. He believed in strict academic hierarchies. A secretary's name did not belong on the title page. Even when the secretary had done half the thinking herself. Her voice grew sharper. I discovered documents. I designed methods of analysis. He used them all. And what was I to receive? A line of thanks, perhaps, and a pensionless dismissal. Her words rang with long-suppressed bitterness. In that moment I saw clearly, beneath her meek exterior burned a sharp intelligence and a deep resentment. The kind that festers for years until it demands expression. She caught herself, exhaled slowly, and added in a quieter voice, still, I served him faithfully. Until the end. I let the silence stretch, watching her face. Faith and fury, side by side. Reflection. When the door closed behind her, I leaned back in my chair. The inspector's pencil had stopped moving. He looked at me uneasily. What do you make of it? Morrison asked. I tapped the notebook with my finger. 4 sets of motives, Inspector. Cross had academic jealousy. Lady Margaret had family honor to protect. The students had ambition and resentment. And Miss Hale, she had 20 years of labor denied and discarded. He whistled softly. Each with reason enough. But who had the cunning to poison ink and the access to do it? Precisely the question, I answered. This was no common killing. It required planning, patience, and knowledge of Selby's every habit. The poisoner must have known where the inkpot was kept, when it would be brought forth, and how Selby handled his pen. That narrows the field. Motive is important, Inspector. But method, method will reveal the hand. The mist thickened outside, blurring the college windows into gray smudges of light. Inside the chamber, the suspect's words still hung in the air: ambition, fear, loyalty, betrayal. The crime had stripped bare not only the life of one man, but the hidden truths of all who had surrounded him. The question was no longer whether Selby's manuscript would reveal scandal. The greater scandal was already upon us, that among this circle of scholars and patrons, one had traded ink for poison, and truth for murder. Chapter 6: The Locked Cabinet Mystery. The morning's interrogations had stripped bare the emotions of each guest: ambition, fear, resentment, but words alone would not solve this crime. Motives are plentiful in any murder, it is the method that narrows the field. And so, after our questioning concluded, Inspector Morrison and I returned to Selby's study to examine the physical evidence. The room had been sealed overnight, the heavy oak door secured by the constable on duty. When we entered, the air still carried the faint tang of spilt ink and smoke from the fire that had died low in the grate. The chalk outline of the professor's body remained on the rug, grim reminder of where he had fallen. Across the desk, his manuscript lay scattered in stiff pages, each marred with blotches of dried blue ink. "Observe, Inspector," I said, gesturing to the chaos before us. This was no crime of passion. It required foresight. The killer planned the method with care, prepared the means in advance, and relied upon the professor's own habits to complete the act. Morrison grunted. Poison in an inkpot, devilish clever. I'd never have thought of it myself. That is the point, I replied. Only someone who knew Selby well would have devised it. They understood he suffered cuts upon his hands. They knew he would dip that pen, handle it repeatedly, and that the poison would find its way into his blood. I moved to the tall glass-fronted cabinet in the corner of the study. Its shelves held curiosities, a pair of ivory bookends, several parchment scrolls, a Tudor seal, and the space where the inkpot had once rested. The lock bore no marks of tampering. Morrison handed me the professor's waistcoat chain, with its small cabinet key still dangling at the end. "See here," I said, turning the key in the lock. "No scratches, no forcing. The murderer did not pick this lock. They used the key itself." The inspector frowned. "Then only the professor could have taken it out." "Not necessarily," I countered. Selby had the habit of laying aside his watch and chain when working with delicate manuscripts. He might set it on the mantel, or leave it on the desk during tea. Those who visited him regularly would have known this. We called in Miss Hale once more to clarify the professor's routines. She entered reluctantly, her gray eyes sharp behind her spectacles. "Miss Hale," I said, "tell us plainly, when was the inkpot placed upon this desk?" Her voice was quiet but steady. "That is what struck me as odd, Mr. Pinkerton. I arrived yesterday afternoon to prepare the study. The inkpot was already on the desk, positioned prominently. Yet the professor never instructed me to bring it out. He usually asked for it himself." "You are certain?" I pressed. "Yes. Quite certain. It was there when I entered." At the time, the professor was lecturing to his advanced students. He did not return until nearly 4 o'clock. That detail was damning. It meant the inkpot had been placed on the desk while Selby was absent. Whoever did so not only had access to the locked cabinet but also timed their action with precision. To confirm the timeline, we summoned Mrs. Whitmore, the college housekeeper, a stout woman with a wrinkled face and the frank manner of one who had served the institution for decades. She curtsied awkwardly before us, her hands red from scrubbing. "I dusted this study at 3 o'clock, sir," she told me. "And I noticed the inkpot already set out. Thought it odd, since the professor wasn't here. He only brought it out on special occasions, usually when he wanted to impress a guest." "And you are sure of the hour?" "Yes, sir. I keep to a strict schedule. 3 o'clock sharp, every Wednesday." I glanced at Miss Hale. She nodded. The professor was lecturing from 2:30 to 4. He could not have placed it here himself. The implication was clear: while Selby taught his class, someone else had entered his study, unlocked the cabinet, and tainted the ink. I examined the inkpot again. It was ornate, silver chased with Tudor roses, its patina dark with age. But beneath the rim, faint discoloration suggested the residue of something more sinister. Inspector Morrison had already sent a sample for chemical analysis, though results would take days. "The poison was mixed directly with the ink," I said. "Not simply coated on the pen or the lid. That required knowledge of chemistry, and time enough to work without interruption." Morrison's brow furrowed. "Who had opportunity yesterday afternoon?" "Dr. Cross called on Selby about administrative matters," Miss Hale said. "He stayed nearly an hour. After he left, Lady Margaret visited to confirm the evening's arrangements. And the students came and went throughout the day, as was their custom. I myself was present nearly the whole time, preparing correspondence and notes. I studied her carefully. Her tone was even, but there was a flicker of something beneath the surface. Loyalty, perhaps. Or something else." The inspector rubbed his chin. "So any one of them might have slipped it out." "Not any one," I corrected. "The murderer needed 3 things: access to the cabinet, opportunity during Selby's absence, and confidence to handle a priceless artifact without arousing suspicion. That narrows our list." We dismissed Miss Hale and the housekeeper, leaving Morrison and me alone once more. The inspector paced by the fire, muttering. Cross had the knowledge, no doubt. But Lady Margaret had the family reputation to protect. And the secretary, she knew his habits as well as anyone. I sat at the desk, my eyes resting on the ink-stained manuscript. It is not enough to name who had cause. Many had cause. We must ask, who possessed both the intellect to devise this method and the boldness to risk discovery? The silence of the room answered with its own weight. Through the frosted windows, I watched students cross the quadrangle, their gowns flapping in the wind. None of them knew that in this chamber, scholarship had been turned into a weapon, a man's pen transformed into his death sentence. I closed my notebook, resolved. Inspector, we are not dealing with an impulsive crime. This is the work of someone who lived in Selby's shadow, who understood him better than he knew himself. Someone who saw the inkpot not as a relic but as the perfect instrument. Morrison looked at me uneasily. You mean the murderer wasn't just clever, they were intimate? Exactly, I said. The hand that placed the inkpot upon this desk was one he trusted. Chapter 7, The Devoted Secretary's Secret. The afternoon was bitterly cold, the mist thickening over Oxford's quadrangles until the spires vanished into grey haze. Inspector Morrison and I remained in the college, sifting through the late professor's private effects under lock and key. Murder is rarely solved by confession, more often, it yields to paper. Men conceal their feelings in life, but their ledgers, their wills, their correspondence, they betray more than spoken words ever could. I asked the inspector for access to Selby's desk and personal files. At first he hesitated, fearing censure from the Dons, but I reminded him that the study had already become a crime scene. No parchment or letter was above scrutiny. With some reluctance, he relented, and together we began to search. The professor's filing system was orderly to a fault, drawers neatly divided, bundles of letters tied with string, accounts tabulated in a steady hand. Among them we found a folder marked, Personal Affairs. Inside were banking records, receipts, and at the back, a will dated only 3 months prior. I read it twice, then passed it to Morrison. "It is most illuminating," I said. The professor bequeaths modest sums to the college, several gifts to academic societies, and his manuscript to the Bodleian Library. Yet do you see what is absent? Morrison scanned the pages, his lips tightening. Miss Hale. Not a shilling. Precisely. After 20 years of service, loyal, constant, her name is nowhere, save a brief mention that she is to be given a reference. Nothing more. The inspector frowned. A hard blow, perhaps, but hardly proof of murder. "Wait," I said, withdrawing another paper from the file. It was an earlier draft of the will, dated the previous year. In that version, Miss Dorothy Hale was promised a substantial legacy, enough to secure her comfort for the remainder of her days. Its removal in the new document was no accident. I placed both wills side by side on the table. 1 year ago, she was rewarded generously. 3 months ago, she was written out entirely. Something happened between those dates, Inspector. Something that soured Selby's view of his secretary. Our answer came in the form of a series of letters tucked beneath a sheaf of receipts. They were addressed to Selby's solicitor. In one, the professor wrote, "I regret to inform you that Miss Hale has grown presumptuous in her expectations. She believes herself entitled to credit for work that remains mine by right. Her assistance, though valuable, has overstepped its bounds. I must take steps to remind her of her station. In my new will, she is to receive nothing beyond a reference." Morrison let out a low whistle. That would cut deep. 20 years of labor, erased with the stroke of a pen. "And note his words," I said, tapping the page. "She believes herself entitled to credit." That tells us more than Selby intended. He was not merely denying her money. He was denying her intellectual recognition. We dug deeper, and the truth surfaced in a hidden folder at the bottom of a drawer. Within were pages upon pages written in neat feminine hand, Dorothy Hale's hand. They were not dictations. They were analyses, observations, interpretations of Elizabethan documents, brimming with originality. Cross-references filled the margins, insights that linked one piece of evidence to another with clarity. Morrison read them with widening eyes. This is Selby's manuscript." "No," I corrected him. "This is the foundation of it." These notes were hers. Much of what Selby claimed as discovery, she had already outlined. In short, she was not merely his secretary. She was his collaborator, indeed, his co-author. But he refused to acknowledge her either in print or in his will. The inspector shook his head, astonished. So he used her scholarship, took the credit, and cut her out. That's motive if ever I've seen it. More than motive, I said. It is betrayal compounded over decades. Imagine, 20 years of labor, every day in his shadow, believing one's work would finally be recognized, only to find one's name stricken from both book and legacy. For a woman of intellect, denied recognition because of her sex and station, that is a bitter draught indeed. The last piece of evidence lay folded in a separate envelope. It was a carbon copy of a letter to Selby's publisher. In it, he credited Dr. Margaret Ashworth of Cambridge with valuable assistance in research. Yet the passages he described matched precisely with Miss Hale's handwriting in the notes we had just discovered. He had planned to give her work to another scholar entirely. I set the letter down with deliberate care. If ever a man signed his own death warrant, this was it. Selby not only robbed her of money, but of authorship, the recognition she had earned. He intended to erase her existence from the record of scholarship. Morrison exhaled slowly, the weight of it sinking in. Then she had cause. Real cause. But cause alone doesn't mean she acted. True, I said. We must test her with these discoveries. We found Miss Hale in the college library, working at a desk surrounded by index cards and reference books. Her composure was remarkable. She looked up as we approached, her eyes betraying neither fear nor surprise. She set her pen down with precision, folded her hands, and waited. Miss Hale, I said quietly, we have been examining Professor Selby's personal papers. There are matters we must discuss. Her gaze did not waver. I wondered when you would come. It was only a matter of time. You knew of the change to his will? She inclined her head. I typed the final draft myself. One of my last duties. And the notes we found in his drawer, the analyses in your hand? Her lips tightened. Yes. They are mine. For years I gave him my nights, my weekends. I pursued leads he never had time to follow. I unearthed documents in provincial archives. And yet, in the manuscript, I am merely Miss H. A capable secretary. Her voice trembled now, though she kept it low. Do you know what it is, Mr. Pinkerton, to give your life to a man's work and be discarded like a spent quill? I did not answer. Instead, I watched her, weighing her bitterness against her composure. In her words I heard not madness, but cold clarity. At last she drew a breath and mastered herself. But what does it matter now? The professor is dead, his manuscript in ruins. My name will never be on the cover of any book. We left her there in the library, seated amidst the tools of scholarship that had enslaved her life. Outside, the mist pressed against the glass, turning the quadrangle into a blur of shadow. As we crossed back to the study, I spoke to Morrison. The picture is forming, Inspector. Betrayal, intellectual theft, denial of recognition, these are not small slights to an ambitious mind. They are wounds, festering for years. And sometimes, wounds demand redress. The inspector gave a low grunt. So she killed him. I shook my head. Not yet proven. But the hand that poisoned that inkpot had knowledge as intimate as hers. Knowledge of his schedule, his habits, and his weaknesses. And she had the motive most personal of all. We are closer to the truth. But the final piece remains. Chapter 8, The Final Revelation. By evening, the mists had thickened over Oxford until the college courtyard seemed like cloisters of shadow. Lanterns glowed faintly through the fog, and the cold pressed in with biting teeth. Inspector Morrison and I summoned the guests back into Professor Selby's study. The chamber had been set in order, though the stained rug and chalk outline remained grim reminders of the crime committed there. They entered one by one. Lady Margaret Winthrop, regal though pale, her composure held together by sheer force of habit. Dr. Julian Cross, drawn and weary, eyes shifting behind his spectacles as though searching for escape. The three graduate students, subdued and nervous, whispering among themselves. Finally, Miss Dorothy Hale, her grey dress as severe as her expression, her hands folded with quiet control. I waited until all were seated before speaking. The silver inkpot had been returned to the desk, its tarnished gleam catching the lamplight. I let their eyes fall upon it, knowing its presence carried the weight of accusation. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, "we gather tonight not for scholarship, but for justice. Yesterday you witnessed the sudden death of Professor Edwin Selby. At first it seemed a seizure, a tragic collapse. But the evidence tells another story. He was murdered." The word struck the room like a thunderclap. Even those who had heard it before flinched at its finality. I gestured toward the desk. The method was simple in its execution yet ingenious in its conception. A swift-acting alkaloid poison was mixed with the ink in this pot. Professor Selby, accustomed to working with small cuts upon his fingers, absorbed the poison as he wrote. Within minutes, his life was ended. The murderer required 3 things: access to the locked cabinet where this inkpot was stored, knowledge of the professor's exact habits, and a motive compelling enough to risk such a calculated act. Dr. Cross cleared his throat. But any of us might have tampered with it. The cabinet key, surely Selby kept it with him. Indeed, I said, but not always. At tea, during lectures, when handling delicate documents, he often laid aside his chain. That habit was known to those closest to him. Someone seized that opportunity yesterday afternoon, while Selby was lecturing, and placed the tainted inkpot upon his desk. I turned first to Dr. Cross. "You, sir, had much to lose. Selby's discoveries threatened to destroy 30 years of your published work. You possess knowledge enough to identify a toxin. Yet your access was limited. You visited him briefly that day, but you lacked the freedom to linger unseen. Your rivalry was academic, bitter, yes, but insufficient to explain so intimate a murder." Cross's face flushed crimson. He opened his mouth to retort, then thought better of it, bowing his head. Next, I faced Lady Margaret. You feared disgrace. The Winthrop name, tied to rebellion, would have been ruined. The blow to your reputation might have undone your charitable works and your social standing. But at the hour when the inkpot was poisoned, you were meeting with the dean of the college. Records confirm your presence elsewhere. You had cause, but not the opportunity. She exhaled in relief, though her trembling hands betrayed the toll of suspicion. I let the silence build before continuing. The students, ambitious, yes. Resentful, perhaps. But they lacked both the knowledge and the daring. They could no more devise this method than they could replicate Selby's scholarship. Their fear is genuine. They are witnesses, not conspirators. My eyes moved at last to the woman who had sat in silence, her gray eyes steady upon me. "Which leaves only you, Miss Dorothy Hale." Her face did not change, though a flicker passed through her eyes. She folded her hands more tightly in her lap. "For 20 years, I said, you served Selby faithfully. You typed his manuscripts, transcribed his notes, collated his references. But you did far more. You discovered documents. You devised analyses. You created frameworks without which his work could not stand. In short, you were his co-author in all but name. Yet he denied you credit. He stripped you from his will. He planned to give your labor to another scholar altogether. Betrayed in work, betrayed in legacy, he meant to erase you." Her lips tightened. Still she did not speak. I leaned closer, my voice lowering. "You alone possessed the 3 essentials, the knowledge of his habits, the access to his cabinet key, and the motive, personal, searing, undeniable. You poisoned the inkpot, Miss Hale. You turned the very instrument of his pride into the weapon of his destruction. For the first time, her composure cracked. A tremor ran through her hands. She lifted her gaze to mine, and in her eyes I saw not madness, but the cold certainty of a mind that had calculated every step. "You are very thorough, Mr. Pinkerton," she said at last, her voice low. "Yes, I typed the will that cast me aside. Yes, I wrote the notes he claimed as his own. And yes," she glanced at the inkpot, her expression hardening, "I chose the only justice left to me. If I could not sign my name to his book, then he would never write another word." Gasps rose from the company. Lady Margaret pressed her hand to her chest, while Dr. Cross muttered a prayer. The students shrank back, horrified. Inspector Morrison stepped forward, cuffs in hand, but Miss Hale rose before he reached her. Her back was straight, her dignity intact. "Do not trouble yourself, Inspector," she said. "I will come quietly. I have no regrets." As she was led from the room, she paused at the door. Her eyes lingered on the desk, upon the ink-stained manuscript that lay in ruins. "My work dies with him," she said simply. "Perhaps that is justice enough." The door closed behind her, and silence filled the chamber. The flames in the hearth crackled faintly, the only sound. I looked around at the shaken faces of those who remained. "This," I said quietly, "is what pride and betrayal breed. 2 lives destroyed, one by poison, the other by justice. Remember it well." The following morning, as I left Oxford for London, the mists lifted slightly, revealing the spires bathed in pale winter light. Behind me, in Selby's study, his unfinished manuscript remained, stained, scattered, silenced forever. History would never know the truths he promised. What endured instead was the greater lesson, that the hunger for recognition, when denied, can turn scholar to murderer, and devotion to revenge. For me, it was another case concluded. Yet the echoes of that ink-stained night at Ashwell College would linger long in memory, proof that in the pursuit of truth, men and women alike may kill to claim their place in history.